So now, to move to our speakers. The Mid-Atlantic's love affair with the bard is by no means a recent development. Colonial audiences would have seen touring and resident companies perform popular titles from Shakespeare's tragedies and history plays, as well as titles by Restoration and 18th century playwrights such as Nicholas Rowe, Thomas Otway, and Joseph Addison. These plays filled a gap in the dramatic repertory insofar as an indigenous American drama would not emerge until the mid-19th century. These canonical titles also reinforced Englishmen, reminding, boy, I'm sorry, this didn't print out well, colonists that despite their removal, they were still British subjects who shared a common language and artistic inheritance with the motherland. Given these emotional and cultural ties, it should not surprise that Shakespeare became the testing ground for the battles over racial and national identity that would emerge during the Civil War and beyond. Amidst current calls to decolonize Shakespeare, it is easy to forget that his plays long have been a lightning rod for cultural contestation. That's a good word. Drew, are you going to speak first, or are you both going to come up here? Yeah. So Dr. Brew Lichtenberg has served as the resident dramaturg. Yes? You can see I'm not well-versed in your field. A resident scholar who provides feedback, historical, contextual, and critical, on the theater's productions for the Shakespeare Theatre Company since the 2011-12 season. He's worked on over 55 productions, from world premieres to plays throughout the Shakespeare canon. His dramaturgy credits include international, oh my God, it goes on and on. Do I need to read them all? Broadway, everywhere you've been, and including the Woolly Mammoth Theater. He also has taught courses at the Catholic University of America and a David Griffin School of Drama at Yale University, and the Eugene Lang College of the Liberal Arts at the New School. Dr. Deborah Payne is Emerita Professor of Literature at American University, and to date she's published on topics ranging as wildly as Samuel Pepys. And you know, I've called him, different teachers have called Pepys and Pepys. It is Pepys, right? You know, I was reading his autobiographical, the papers, the book that was produced a few years ago, and I kept going between different teachers that had used his name in different ways. But it's Pepys. Okay, thank you for clearing that up for me. Theatrical spectatorship, the plight of Restoration actresses, the Shakespeare authorship controversy, and which is big, still going on, right? And the extent to which theater influenced Jane Austen. Major books include the Cambridge Companion to English Restoration Theater in 2000, 4 Libertine plays from the Restoration in 2005, and revisiting Shakespeare's Lost play in 2017. Recently, she published The Business of English Restoration Theater, 1660 to 1700. That was last year. And with Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, the Shakespeare Theatre Company, 1986 to 2021. Currently, she's working on 2 projects. The first, a short study of early modern acting styles, and the second, an in-depth account of theater in London during World War II. You're quite versatile in century, okay? So what an exciting thing for us to hear. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Should we use this, or do I use your iPad?
No, I think this is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so Deborah and I are going to speak together since we co-authored the book. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I also just want to recognize Anne Greer for suggesting that we speak to the Alexandria Historical Society, because I think, Anne, you came to one of our other book talks where we mentioned this topic in passing, that there's quite a long, extensive history of Shakespeare in the mid-Atlantic, in Virginia and Maryland especially, and you said, I have just the venue for you and Deborah to speak at. So here we are at this beautiful venue, the Lyceum, which is making me feel all sorts of feelings that you're going to see explained, because architecture is one of the things we're going to talk about.
We are.
So yeah, I just want to thank you, Anne, and a bunch of other familiar faces who I now realize live in this part of the DMV area before we get started. And we're also going to, some of this might be familiar to those of you who have read the book, but if you have not read the book, I encourage you. You can find it on Amazon, on bookshop.org. We carry it at the Shakespeare Theatre Company in our bookshops. It's a quick, easy, fun, fascinating, informative read, if I do say so myself. And it was a lot of fun to write with my partner here, Deborah Payne.
It was fun.
So Deborah, do you want to start and then we can alternate?
Okay, all right.
And I'll click.
Okay.
So we're going to trade off. We're going to trade off points, because this is very much how we wrote the book. I would send a draft, Deborah would send it back, and
vice versa, and overwriting it worked well.
Worked very well.
It worked very well. So one of the things that got us started on this project was, how did DC, or the DC area, the Mid-Atlantic area, become the most prevalent for Shakespeare? And that's what started us on this journey. If you think about it, the influence is everywhere, right? From the Folger Shakespeare Library on Capitol Hill, which is only 2 blocks from the Supreme Court and the U.S. Congress, to Shakespeare's statue in Library of Congress. If you go into the reading room, of course, he's up on, the second level, and he looks down beneficently on the readers below. He's also an inescapable figure every year on London stages. The Shakespeare Theatre, of course, operates 2 playhouses, and you have the Folger Theatre, which we're going to talk about more at length. And then, not right now, but until recently, we had a lot of small companies doing Shakespeare around the area as well. And of course, you get Shakespeare-themed ballets, you get Verdi operas based on Othello. DC really has become a global center for Shakespeare.
And if you look at the size of DC, you would think, well, New York would be the capital of Shakespeare in America. San Francisco would be the capital, or Los Angeles the capital, all these other centers of the show business industry. And yet, you could argue that for a city the size of Washington, D.C., there's more Shakespeare per capita in this city than any other city in America, if not in the world. And this relationship goes back quite deep. In fact, Shakespeare, more than any other Anglophone writer, represents the cultural origins of Britain's former colony, which is America. It's kind of a weird thing when you think about it, that Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States of America, would adopt the national playwright or the bard of England as its resident house playwright. There's a fascination that is easily documentable today with the plethora of Shakespearean offerings in Washington, D.C., and one of the things that Deborah and I were interested in writing about in the book, particularly in the first section, is how far back does this relationship go, and why does it go so far back to colonial Jamestown or colonial Annapolis?
So let's,
Awkward transition.
Awkward transition, yeah, let's go to the...
Go back to Annapolis and Jamestown first?
Yeah, let's go back to that. Actually, we have an image of the first performance.
Oh yeah, but it's much later in the slideshow. I thought we were going to talk about Ford's first.
You want to talk about that? Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We'll work back sequentially.
Okay.
Because one of the things that is not often linked to Shakespeare is, of course, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by the coward John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. Lincoln was not watching a Shakespeare play that night. He was watching a play called Our American Cousin by a British playwright named Tom Taylor, which was actually an export to the American theater scene. It had been a hit the previous season in England, and then came to Ford's in America. So in Act 3, Scene 2, as represented here, Booth fires a .44 caliber Derringer into Lincoln's head.
And one of the things that interested me, and this was sort of my theory, and Drew thought this was plausible, we put it in the book, I was really interested because of the Booth's Shakespearean inheritance. His father was an English actor, well known for doing Shakespeare. His brother Edwin became a very notable Shakespeare actor, working frequently in New York. And as a matter of fact, when the Booth's father died, there was a bust of Shakespeare at his funeral, looking down on his coffin. I mean, that's how intense the relationship was. And I believed he named his farm in Maryland, Tudor Place. So, I mean, there's a very, very self-conscious attempt to suture the Booths to this Anglophone inheritance that Drew mentioned. But one thing I think is really interesting is that Lincoln actually was rather ignorant of Shakespeare earlier in his life. He read Shakespeare, but he had very little experience of going to theater other than kind of minstrel shows, musical reviews, and that changed after he became president. He saw his first opera, Verdi Opera, in New York, and it was during the Civil War that he started actually attending Shakespearean productions frequently at Ford's Theater, and he said that it helped him. It helped him grapple with the tragedy of what he was going through and took him out of himself. He was seeing a lot of Shakespeare prior to the assassination. I actually think that it's deliberate that Booth assassinated him at a production of Our American Friend, which if you've ever looked at the play, I mean, it's not great. I mean, it's kind of a trashy farce.
It has its moments.
It's got a couple of moments, but I mean, it ain't Shakespeare, right? And I think that he wanted to make sure that Lincoln was not ennobled by being assassinated at a production of a Shakespearean tragedy. And so he made sure that everybody knew what he was watching. He was watching this lowbrow import farce from England. He wasn't seeing there at Othello or Lear or Hamlet. So that's my own theory that this was a deliberate move. Why do I say that? Booth knew everybody at Ford's Theater, which evidently was a hotbed of support for the South. Yeah, and so he could have gotten Lincoln's schedule for when he attended very, very easily.
Right, so here you see pictured Junius Brutus Booth Sr., who was John Wilkes's father, who was actually a British emigre to America, and was also, I believe, the first actor to perform Shakespeare west of the Mississippi. So was a key figure in proliferating Shakespeare as an American acting tradition. There's his brother Edwin, who was a Union sympathizer and was probably the most famous Hamlet of his generation. And here's John Wilkes, who was born, like Edwin, at the Booth Tudor Place in Bel Air, Maryland. And there was also a third Booth brother named originally Junius Brutus Jr. And about 6 weeks before the assassination of Lincoln, the three Booth brothers performed a charity production of Julius Caesar, playing the roles of Caesar, Brutus, and I believe Mark Antony, as part of a fundraiser for a statue of William Shakespeare that still stands in Central Park. And it was performed at the Winter Garden Theater in New York, which was a theater that Edwin Booth owned, right? So there's a very extensive connection here between the North and the South, the Booth family and Shakespeare, and this question that Deborah is raising of which side of this political divide in America does Shakespeare as cultural property belong to? It's very much a site of contestation that this very famous moment in theater history and also American history plays out in microcosm.
And so if Booth's assassination of Lincoln suggests this kind of primal theatrical as well as historical scene, I think it's significant that its backdrop was Washington, D.C., which, if you think about it, it was a city formed by compromise, congressional compromise, and governed for a long time by the patrician planter class of theater-loving Anglophiles. And yeah, can we?
You want me to go back?
Well, I want to show the image of where people are coming from and settling.
I think it's
Yep. Here we go. Okay. So this actually explains why our area, Virginia, Maryland, what we might think of as the Chesapeake area, becomes the area for Shakespeare and for theater in the colonial period. Look at where the migrations are coming in the late 17th, well, actually from the mid-17th century through the early 18th century. New England, which is settled by Puritans from East Anglia, okay, from that area. They tend to be legalists, Calvinists. They do not like theater. They produce people like the divine William Prynne, who publishes, when is History of Mastics published? The 1637?
early 1600s.
Yeah, I want to say 1637, which is insane. I mean, it goes on for about 500 pages, just railing hysterically about theater and entertainment. By the way, he had his ear chopped off for publishing that because he included a line in that that said, women actors, comma, whores. The only women actors in the 1630s were the Queen and her ladies in waiting who were performing at court. Ouch. Yes, and so the court didn't like that very much. Calvinists do not like theater. Okay, and then we've got Virginia, our area, shores of Maryland, down into the Carolinas. Those are settled by high church Anglicans, Church of England people, and Roman Catholics from the southwest of England. They tend to be royalists. They're very much in favor of hierarchy. They're land-owning gentry. They are the Virginia plantation owners who come, and they bring with them all of these royalist attitudes, including a great love of theater. Okay? New York, Pennsylvania, parts of the Delaware Valley, they're settled by the West Midlands, okay? Who also tend to be Calvinists, low Anglican church Protestants. Again, not terribly inclined towards theater. Think of William Penn, okay, Quakers, no theater, no dance, okay, you're not supposed to have that stuff. And then you have a wave into Appalachia a little bit later, and those are nonconformists from Scotland and what you might think of as the borderlands. And they also tend to not like theater very much. And this explains a lot of the attitudes. If we go to the next slide, if we go clockwise, let's see, we've got Increase Mather, okay, on the left, who clearly does not like theater, all the bans on theater. William Penn, the founders of Pennsylvania, founders of Yale College. Theater, by the way, is banned at Yale and the Ivies for a long time. The first performance at Yale is 1870.
1870, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say 73, but yeah, roughly 1870, if you can imagine. You cannot, I mean, even student groups, nobody can perform a play. That is how strong this anti-theatrical prejudice goes in New England. Not here, though, okay? We've got all those royalists who come in the 17th century and continue waves into the 18th century. They love their theater, they love Shakespeare, they love performance, and that, folks, is one of the things that explains why theater and Shakespeare become so centralized here, the Carolinas, that the first theaters are in this area.
Right, so in Pennsylvania, in 1682, the Quakers institute a ban on rude and riotous sports and practices, such as stage plays, masks, revels, bull baitings, and cockfightings. In 1689, Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, publishes a testimony against several profane and superstitious customs, including theater, which he attributes to devil gods, and he calls theater spaces the devil's temples, and stage plays the devil's lectures, and actors the devil's chief factors. And in 1754, the faculty of Yale College, founded, as you can see here, by all these lovely-looking Congregationalist ministers on New Haven Common, bans theater until the year of 1870. No scholar is allowed to act any comedies or tragedies or any other plays or to be present at the acting of them. So if you were a Yale man for all of the 18th century and most of the 19th century, theater was strictly off limits, which helps explain why in 1774, by order of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, there's a nationwide ban on all shows, plays, and other expensive diversions and entertainments. If you look at the historical record, Virginia, where we are right now, and Maryland are the only two colonies that never banned theatrical performance.
They wouldn't go along. Yeah. Yeah, and again, think of, so you have the Anglican planter class in this area. Maryland, of course, is settled by Catholics, and Roman Catholics, all about theater. Long, long tradition. I mean, from Jesuit theater to, you think of the first women acting in Europe, all Roman Catholic countries. Okay, they're not banned as they are in English speaking.
And I think if we go back, in 1603, the first account of English settlers landing on North America is Accomack, Virginia, which is across the Chesapeake Bay. It's an indigenous word meaning the people across the water, appropriately. And also in 1665, you have the first recorded performance of an English language play anywhere in North America in a town in Accomack County. Now, unfortunately, the script of this play is lost, but we know the name of it was Ye Bear and Ye Cub. We know it was written by somebody named William Darby, and we know that it was performed in a tavern, Folks's Tavern. And this is because there was some kind of a puritanical objector, like the Increase Mather of Accomack County, named Edward Martin, who sued. He raised moral objections against William Darby, Cornelius Watkinson, and Philip Howard for, quote, performing a play. And after a rigid cross-examination by the authorities, the three men performed the play in court and were declared not guilty. Now, the other interesting thing is that William Darby, according to historical records, was born in Staffordshire in the West Midlands, only 53 miles away from Shakespeare's birthplace of Stratford-upon-Avon.
Yeah.
So there's a pretty direct link between Virginia specifically and Shakespearean performance or English language theater. And what's our next slide? Yes, Colonial Williamsburg, which is also an early site of theater.
Yeah, it's actually, I believe it's the first playhouse, yes.
First ever playhouse in North America.
First ever playhouse, yeah. And 1715, William Livingston, he made an agreement actually with two people, a couple who were his indentured servants. And the three of them got together and started to, I'll read, to cause to be erected and built at his own proper costs and charge in ye city of Williamsburg, one good substantial house, commodious for acting such plays as shall be thought fit to be acted there. Okay. So I believe, and Drew, you might know more about this than me, we don't know that much, right? We don't have builder's plans or anything, I believe.
This is, I believe, a reconstruction of what they think it might have looked like, which was a kind of simple outdoor theater space with wooden benches and an Elizabethan-style open-air stage.
Yeah, we don't know. This is another recreation from what it would have looked like later on in the 18th century as it expanded And that would follow a very typical pattern for theater buildings that, I mean, even if you go back to the Greek theaters, I mean, they start out as these kind of temporary wooden structures and then over time evolve into grand edifices.
You also have theater at a very early point at William and Mary College in the pre-revolutionary period. Performances of English plays like The Recruiting Officer by George Farquhar, The Busybody by Susanna Centlivre,
And Beggar's Opera.
Beggar's Opera by John Gay. You also have theater in Annapolis, Maryland, which, another piece of trivia, served as the nation's capital between 1783 and 1784, and played host in pre-revolutionary times to resident companies such as the American Company of David Douglas and the Maryland Company of Comedians. Annapolis is also home to the first red brick theater in the colonies, of which there are no surviving pictures, the West Street Theater, which featured an entirely British repertory of Otway, Farquhar, Rowe, Gay, and of course, Shakespeare.
And maybe this is a moment to talk a little bit about colonial repertories.
Sure.
Okay, so a really interesting pattern, not only for the United States, but this would be true for any colonial outpost from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, that it takes a while to grow in indigenous theater. And if you look at the repertory of companies in the 18th century, well into the 19th century, is basically British plays. It's Shakespeare and British plays. And it's really not until the mid-19th century that you actually get, Native Americans, people born here writing plays. They're not very good. I don't know I've read a few of them, and they're interesting sociologically. I wouldn't make any great aesthetic arguments for them, but it takes a long time to kind of grow a native theatrical culture. And if you think that we had theater here since the 17th century, well, how long does it take to get to somebody like O'Neill? Right, a long time. And that's, by the way, that is true for country after country after country. It's a really interesting pattern that whether, I'm thinking, Drew, you would know this better than me because you have much better background in German theater, but my understanding is, German theater, they're basically doing French, right? They're doing French neoclassical tragedy and comedy for a long time until you get, the growth of a national theater.
Right. And another good example of this phenomenon is George Washington himself, who is, of course, descended from landowning gentry, studies fox hunting with Lord Fairfax of Fairfax County, and famously, during the winter of the Revolutionary Army at Valley Forge, pays out of pocket for a production of a British theater play, Joseph Addison's Roman heroic tragedy, Cato.
Which was wildly popular in the 18th
Hugely
century.
Popular.
Huge.
And so appropriate that we have Seneca to the left of us and Cicero to the right here in the Lyceum. I can see that the classical tradition continues to this day in this part of the world. Now, we don't know much about the details of what this performance looks like, but my old professor from undergrad, Mark Evans Bryan, argues that this performance was an emblem of gentility, of a kind of aristocracy, enjoying the finer things in life, and a deeply attractive indulgence for the burgeoning and contested aristocracy of the Continental Army, that it was a kind of reclamation or reconstitution of British cultural inheritance as their own proof of a kind of new aristocracy for this fledgling country.
Interesting.
And of course, Washington is the one who picked out the site for what would become Washington, D.C.
And one of the things that we discovered in our research is that when Pierre L'Enfant was planning Washington, D.C., he had envisioned that there would be a huge avenue, that would go down the center of the city. I guess it would be Pennsylvania Avenue, but he said it will be a grand avenue lined with playhouses, rooms of assembly, academies, and all sorts of places. And that did not come to pass, but that was part of his vision, that playhouses would be an essential part of the original design of Washington, D.C., which is fascinating. There was a small theater in Washington, D.C. around 1800. I think it was simply called the theater, wasn't it?
The National Theater.
No. I think
the Washington Theater.
The Washington Theater. And supposedly, I mean, we have a couple of contemporary accounts. It was very simple. Evidently, the acoustics were quite good. We don't have much in the record of what was performed there. I'm assuming, again, it would have been the classical English repertory.
What happens in 1812? Well, the British come and they sack Washington, they occupy Washington, and they burn the nascent Library of Congress to the ground. According to legend, this had 3,000 volumes in it. It was actually less than that, but most of them were gathered from Thomas Jefferson's own private library at Monticello. And what do you think was in Jefferson's private library? Shakespeare.
Yeah, this is actually, these are pages from the catalog of Jefferson's library. I just wanted to point out, okay, this is what he had in terms of tragedy. He has Addison's work, which includes the Cato that Washington performed in Valley Forge. We have lots of ancient theater, lots of Aeschylus. Notice how much Shakespeare. We have Capel's notes and readings to Shakespeare. We have a concordance to Shakespeare. We have Dodd's beauties of Shakespeare. And then you get lots of other things. You get Otway, you get Rowe, you get
Sophocles.
Sophocles. Well, I'm thinking of the English, Dryden, of course, and then Greek tragedy. So it's basically a compilation of ancient Greek tragedy and English plays. And if we go to comedy, again, you'll see Aristophanes and Terence. So we have the classical tradition. And again, who do we get? We get, Sedley, we get Vanbrugh, we get Wycherley, we get Congreve. The great restoration comedies of the late 17th and early 18th century is what Jefferson wants. He collects. So this is kind of an interesting blueprint of what people were reading and what they valued in the period.
And when they rebuild the Library of Congress after the War of 1812 is over, it's this very idiosyncratic mixture of nascent American identity fused with a kind of English and Greco-Roman classicism. So when you look around Washington, D.C. today, you can see everywhere that there's the White House, the Capitol building, the Supreme Court, the Treasury Department, all paying homage to this 18th century aristocratic or neo-aristocratic ideal popularized by these Georgian planters.
Who are, of course, importing this kind of Neo-Palladian ideal. And if you've ever gone to England, which I'm sure many of you have, you see these kinds of buildings. I mean, they're, everywhere.
And specifically the Lincoln Memorial, echoing the Athenian Parthenon, the Jefferson Memorial, echoing the Pantheon in Rome. But perhaps no building better represents this synthesis of the British literary legacy with the imperial aspirations of young America than the Library of Congress itself, even though it's modeled on the Beaux-Arts Paris Opera at the Palais Garnier. It's a little bit less gaudy than the Paris Opera. No shade against the Paris Opera. But specifically, it's this interior of the dome, right? This image that we started off talking about. You have a Jewish figure in Moses representing religion. You have Beethoven representing music, a German figure. You have Solon, a Greek philosopher representing law and justice. But the one figure who's representing literature is not an American.
But Shakespeare.
It's Shakespeare.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting that when you look at the iconography of Library of Congress, that it is Shakespeare who stands in for all of literature. He is the shorthand for literature.
And the one last profound link between Washington, D.C. and Shakespeare, of course, is the Folger Shakespeare Library, which comes from a different era of American imperialism, the Gilded Age, the early 20th century. Henry Clay Folger was the president of Standard Oil, right, traveling the world collecting these Shakespeare folios. And in 1932, when they unveiled the final model of the Folger Shakespeare Library, there's a staggering number of folios, the largest collection of folios and Shakespeare-related documents anywhere in the world, far outstripping Stratford-upon-Avon, far outstripping the British Library, and constructed in this very Washingtonian way. You have kind of Beaux-Arts, Arts Deco, marble on the outside, and then you have this kind of Tudor style, right? Thinking of Junius Brutus Booth, Tudor Place, like it's literally a recreation of a Tudor style English mansion on the inside.
And actually, some of the materials were imported from the UK, from houses that were being dismantled, that they just brought over almost and reconstructed in the library. One of the things that's really interesting about Mr. Folger is that he had a choice of where to site that library. He was an alumnus of Amherst College and had very strong ties to Massachusetts, but he and his wife Emily had lived in New York for many, many years, and before they built the Shakespeare Library, unbelievably, they had all these priceless manuscripts and folios and quartos sitting in basically townhouses, row houses in Brooklyn, just piled up, and there are eyewitness accounts of these things just piled up literally floor to ceiling until, and I believe it took nearly a year to truck everything down from New York to the library. That's how much stuff he had. I mean, he almost didn't know what he had. But he could have built that library anywhere. Where does he build it? Washington, D.C.
And here's a wonderful quote about Henry Clay Folger from his own mouth saying, "I did think of placing the library at Stratford-upon-Avon, near the bones of the great man himself, but I finally concluded I would give it to Washington because I'm an American." And according to legend, he was inspired about the site for the original Folger Library when he had a layover at Union Station. That's like the interior of the train station on Massachusetts Avenue, and just went for a walk around Capitol Hill. I thought, 2 blocks away from the Library of Congress and Supreme Court seems like a good location for my library. So these links between Shakespeare and Washington, D.C., they go deep, they go long, and they're very, very complex and complicated ones.
And they're profound. And one of the reasons we talked a bit about architecture and geography is if you think of the contiguity, right, that he cites his library not just in Washington, but that it is literally just up the street from the Congress, from Library of Congress. It's making a statement. I mean, about the seats of power being connected to this very rich English inheritance, this literary legacy.
And you could almost say Washington, D.C. is a very Shakespearean town, off stage as much as on stage. How many times have we seen political cartoons of LBJ as Richard III or whoever? Right?
Well, or think of how often newscasters use the term Shakespearean to describe political goings-on, right? That it is Shakespearean, it's over the top, it's epic, it's big and theatrical.
And as for which Shakespeare character our current president reminds you of, that's a topic for another.
That's a whole other thing, yeah.
Do we have some time to take any questions from people? Yes, Peter.
Towards the beginning of your talk, you showed how late it was for drama to be written in America. What was going on with the rest of the literary world at that time?
That's a really great question. I mean, you do have poetry, you have the novel. American literature is not my bailiwick, But, you know, if you think of the early American novel, I mean, certainly by the early 19th century or the transcendental writers, I mean, there's already a very, very rich literary tradition. It does take drama a while to develop. Some of that, I wonder how much of that has to do with a touring tradition also that goes back to the 17th century, or actually the 18th century, that you've got bands of English players who are doing this kind of circuit where they're going from England, they go the Caribbean to either the Carolinas or the Mid-Atlantic, they perform in Annapolis, and then so you get this circuit, and that continues for a long time. So I think, and Drew, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. I'm thinking off the top of my head that you really do need resident companies and actors to develop a rich dramatic tradition. I think the two go hand in hand.
Well, yeah, you have Emerson and Thoreau, you have the New England transcendentalists, who of course are huge Shakespeare fanatics. And some people say that Henry Clay Folger was taking a seminar in the Transcendental School when he read their love of Shakespeare, and that began his journey. And then you have, in the 19th century, figures like Whitman, Melville, both of whom are huge Shakespeare lovers, right? So it's interesting that they're creating these works that are Shakespearean in scope and complexity, but not in the theater, right? And you only need a publishing house, right, to print however many copies of Moby Dick, right, for that to then become the great American novel. Whereas it does take more of an infrastructure for that to happen theatrically. But also, I think one of the things we argue in our book is that the trauma of, I mean, there was a healthy and thriving theatrical district in Washington, D.C. up until the assassination of Lincoln. And the trauma of this, I mean, Ford's Theater is closed for many, many, many years, for decades after that, and it only reopens much later as a museum and as part of the National Park Service. So there are these moments when Washington, D.C. could develop a theatrical ecosystem, and that's interrupted because of this civil war that's literally tearing the country apart between the North and the South, and that culture war in many ways remains. Another one of these fallow periods we found in DC theater history is after the 1968 riots, after the assassination of Martin Luther King. You have this incredible hollowing out of downtown Washington, and it's not until the late 80s or 90s that you start to get theaters like the Shakespeare Theatre moving downtown and the redevelopment of Chinatown in the downtown area. So theater is always in a symbiotic relationship with what's happening sociopolitically outside of it. And Melville, you know, he can just move off to New England and be writing Pierre or the Ambiguities in obscurity and not really care about what's going on in the rest of the world.
But I think there's another dimension as well, and that is, I mean, like Lincoln, I found a really interesting quote by Lincoln where before he started seeing Shakespeare at Ford Theater, he said, I don't see basically why you need to see a play. You get everything out of Shakespeare by simply picking up the play and reading it. And that is not an unusual response in the 19th century, and I think that has to do with the prevalence of the novel, which of course becomes the literary form in the 19th century. Everybody's writing and reading novels. And so there becomes this kind of bias against performance of, well, I'll read a play. I'll have the same experience. Of course you don't. But that...
Also all the bans, all the censorship of theater. Going to the theater in the 19th century is a dangerous thing. The biggest theater riot of all time happens in 1848 in Astor Place over productions of Macbeth. Can I say that in the Lyceum? The Scottish play. You know, 24 people lose their lives because of fighting at the theater. So going to the theater in the 19th century is much more like taking your life into your own hands, whereas you can sit home in your study and read your collected works of Shakespeare in a totally different way.
Yeah.
Michelle?
So the Globe Theater accommodated different classes of people, and the Bard's plays were written for different classes of people. So the early American theater, what class or classes were they appealing to?
Right, so this is sort of a question about theater architecture, right? Was there a space for the groundlings as well as for the aristocrats? And also, what is the kind of theater-going audience in colonial era America? Deborah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
I'm going to guess, because the colonial theater, like the theater in, is it Charleston?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Dock Street Theater?
The Dock Street, it's not that big, and it's very fancy, which suggests to me that probably ticket prices were pretty high. And this became very, very contested in England as the 18th century wore on. There were actually theater riots over ticket prices. And you had management, as always, trying to increase prices because they have to keep the shows going. Theater is always struggling financially, one way or another. But the Globe is a huge space. We now think that it seated maybe upwards of 3,400 people, 3,500 people. Fast forward even to the early 18th century theaters, you're talking maybe 800,000. So, do the math. You have to charge a lot more for tickets.
I think another thing in the colonial era that is a problem for theater is that it's seen as being a British thing. If you're somebody who goes to the theater, who patronizes the theater, the New Englanders in Boston, they're throwing tea off of the boats. They don't want these British imports, right? And I think that there's very much a similar perception of theater in the 18th century of only royalists, right, or supporters of King George III are the people going to the theater, and us Yankees up here in Vermont who can't afford a theater, we don't need it, So that changes in the 19th century, but it takes a long time. So by the time you get to Edwin Forrest in the 1840s, the Bowery Theater is 2,000 seats and has a very working class audience that's quite violent. It's twice the size of a Broadway theater today.
And were those more raucous?
Yes, totally. Raucous melodramas, big action sequences, a lot of stuff that we would find quite politically and racially and sexually objectionable today. But it was kind of red meat for the audiences. It was a kind of action extravaganza. Adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, which was the big theatrical phenomenon of the 19th century.
It was the Les Mis of the 19th century, basically.
Yes.
So this is very thought-provoking. I really appreciate this. One thing that you said that really struck me was that Virginia and Maryland were the only two colonies that had not banned theater. So you explained why that's the case for the Puritans and New England and all that. But the southernmost colonies were like the most royalist, right? So why would the theater have been banned in Georgia or South Carolina?
You mean like South Carolina or Georgia?
At the Continental Congress, right?
It's a good question. We didn't look as much at South Carolina or Georgia. I know Charleston had a very early theater and was a very prominent part of this circuit. And also Kingston, Jamaica was hugely, it was probably the wealthiest city in the world at one point in the 18th century. And that's actually where these touring British companies hide out during the Revolutionary War. So that's not really answering your question.
I don't have an but for whatever reason, they complied with the order, and Virginia and Maryland did not, which, again, I think speaks to maybe that just the roots went deeper here, the pro-theatrical roots.
Yeah. Yes, in the back.
There was a theater here in Alexandria near Gatsby's Tavern in the 1800s. I know about that. Yeah. It was on Cameron Street. There was a theater in the 1800s because there was an actress from the company who died in the City Hotel during the performance or during the run of the play. But yeah, there was a theater on Cameron Street in the 1800s.
Well, it's interesting to think of Alexandria being between Mount Vernon and Washington, right? This is like one of the main circuits, right, for theater, and Williamsburg and Annapolis and this kind of, it's really a hotbed if you think about it before New York emerges. Yes?
Washington, D.C. was conceived de novo. So for, many, many years, it's trying
reversionary flow in terms of their...
No, we did not look at Baltimore because we were writing a book about the Shakespeare Theatre in Washington.
You know, kind of evolution of theater, whether they have more established theaters earlier.
Well, in Baltimore, of course, you have St. Paul Street, you have George Calvert Street. So you have these streets that are named after the Catholic gentry founders of Maryland.
I'd have to check. I don't think that you have physical theaters until the 19th century in Baltimore, which is interesting.
I mean, I think Baltimore has always been a city of trade and commerce and a port city, right, where it's centered on the harbor. I mean, there's a lot of wealth for sure. It definitely, by the Gilded Age, right, becomes a place where all those railroad robber barons have huge mansions. But I think it's a different story in Baltimore. And I lived in Baltimore for a couple of years. And you definitely have, like, you have the Peabody Institute, which goes back, but you don't have the same kind of connection to Shakespeare that you do in Washington, D.C., for whatever reason. Yeah.
Seniors themselves.
Yeah.
Instead of directly to Shakespeare, I was learning a different pattern based upon, how long.
I mean, this is just my perception as someone who lived in Baltimore, but was definitely not a Baltimorean. I feel like Washington, D.C. has an inferiority complex about New York, right? We want to be a cultural center like New York does. Baltimore has an inferiority complex regarding Washington, or Philadelphia. It's like, oh, if we could only be as big as Philly or D.C. So I feel like there's a complex dynamic there, where we're comparing ourselves to these international cities and to New York, and Baltimore is like this mid-Atlantic city that is trying to achieve its own identity or express its own identity.
I just, given that Maryland and Virginia were both the two states that never had theater,
Right.
Baltimore being such a wealthy city, would be, I just wondered.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have a great history of theater in Baltimore, for sure.
Was there a time when it went from the British, visiting troops to, Junius or Edward Forrest, when there were like American actors?
Yeah, mid-19th century. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that you're starting, although, again, we were talking about that then you get, that's something that we pull through the book up to today, that there's a kind of struggle over, are you going to develop an American style of performance, an American delivery, or are American actors going to do their Shakespeare with fake British accents, right? And well, you get competing acting styles even in New York. Drew can address that. I mean, that's part of what fuels the Astor Street riots. It fights over, it's basically a fight over performance style.
Edwin Forrest was a Jackson Democrat. He was muscular, he was stocky, he was from a working class background, and he was American, right? So when he did Macbeth, he did him as a roaring, bellowing, almost force of nature.
Like a rancher, he's like a man's man.
Cowboy.
He's a dude,
He also played Spartacus in the original version of Spartacus, not the movie, the play, by Robert Montgomery Byrd. He played Metamora, the last of the Wampanoags, in a ripoff of the Last of the Mohicans on stage, right? He was an American kind of romantic avatar. And his great rival was William McCready, who was a British actor who was like the John Gielgud, or the Ralph Fiennes, maybe I should say, of his day. Elocutionary, sophisticated, technically quite muscular. He was a champion of the original texts, not all these vulgarizations. And Forrest had so many violent supporters that they attacked the supporters of McCready and killed a bunch of them.
Yeah.
So it was nativism versus a kind of cosmopolitanism, which is still a fight that we have in America today. And the history of STC is interesting because Michael Kahn, who became the artistic director in 1986, was an American. He was from Queens, New York. He had taught at Juilliard, and he took very seriously the idea of developing the Shakespeare Theatre as an American counterpart to the RSC that showed that the Americans could do it just as good as the British.
He was very self-conscious of that. I mean, in our interview, I mean, it was very clear that that was foremost.
Quite nationalistic, really.
Yeah, forefront of Michael's mind. And what's so interesting now is that, of course, we have a Brit who runs the STC. And it has become very much a kind, because of Simon's connections with the National Theatre of Great Britain, it's become much more of what kind of exchange, I think.
Well, yeah,
maybe.
this year we had Hugh Bonneville and Uncle Vanya. Last year we had Ralph Fiennes and Macbeth. So the McCrady's are the ones who have the upper hand, you know, instead of the Stacey Keaches, who would be your Edwin Forrest, I guess. Although we do have Wendell Pierce coming next year in Othello, who is an American actor who went to Juilliard and got his start at the Shakespeare Theatre in 1987. So what's interesting is that we are becoming a more international company that mixes together these styles of English classical performance with a more American aesthetic.
So those differences seem to be dissolving, which, of course, is the global world that we inhabit.
And, you know, we're living through a new era of nativism, isolationism, America closing its borders to the world, which doesn't feel like it's a side that we want to be on artistically. We want to be open to the world and part of an international community. So it makes me wonder, would I have been an Edwin Forrest supporter in the 1840s? Probably not. I probably would have been a McCrady supporter. But these things have valences that are coded in all these political and class ways.
Yeah.
One last question.
Back in early theater in America, was Shakespeare using comedies, or history is more popular, and was that tied into whatever was going on politically?
Oh man, that's such a huge question. I mean, if you look at the history of The Merchant of Venice, for example, right? That's a play that is revived by Charles Macklin, an English comic actor, who basically plays Shylock for most of the 18th century. And he plays him as a villain. It's an anti-Semitic caricature. But then after the rise of figures like Benjamin Disraeli, who is the Jewish prime minister of England, you get a more younger, handsome, charming Shylock, right? That these archetypes that Shakespeare writes are not things that are set in stone, but evolve in relation to what's going on off stage.
If you look at if you're asking about sort of the history, the popularity of individual titles, I'm assuming, okay, and this is based on assumption, I don't have scholarship to back this up because I'm not as good on, quite as good on American theater as I am on British. I'm assuming that we follow, because we do for so long, British practice, that if you look at the plays that are really popular in the British repertory going forward, it's always the tragedies. The comedies kind of go up and down. It's kind of particular, and the so-called problem plays fall out of favor. The romances Winter's Tale does well. Tempest isn't done for a long, long time. So it's really interesting, how those things rise and fall. But the tragedies are always popular, always popular. They stay in the repertory, late 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. The others, and the key histories. But the others, they kind of come in and out.
I could go on about this. I mean, Peter Brook has a famous quote where he says, Hamlet is the great tragedy of the 19th century, and King Lear is the great tragedy of the 20th century. That a world in which Hiroshima and Auschwitz and World War II can happen is one where King Lear makes sense. But it was a very unpopular play before then. It was read, but not frequently thought suitable for the stage.
Lear.
Lear,
Yeah,
yes.
Lear,
In fact,
yeah. The ending is changed.
Charles Lamb says it's not producible the way Shakespeare writes it because it's too horrible to be put on stage.
Yeah, Nathaniel Lee rewrites the play in 1683, and he gives it a happy ending. And that is the version that is performed until halfway through the 19th century. That is the version that is performed for nearly 200 years, unbelievably.
Yeah, Samuel Johnson says, I couldn't finish reading Lear, like even just reading it on the page, because it was too horrible to contemplate. So these things are always very contingent and depend on changing audience tastes.
What will be popular in the first part of
The 21st century? What will be popular? Well, we seem to have gone through a kind of recent King Lear phase.
And a Macbeth.
And a Macbeth phase.
And a Much Ado phase.
I mean,
and Tempest.
One thing that's very striking is that this year you have Denzel Washington in Othello on Broadway. We're doing Othello next year at the Shakespeare Company, at the Shakespeare Theatre, and there's a West End production of Othello in the fall that just got announced, which I'm going to be seeing in London. So it feels like for a while Othello was a play that people were scared of producing, because there were no real major productions of Othello the last 5 years, and now all of a sudden there are 3, back to back to back. So it feels like Shakespeare is continuing to serve as a mirror for us, working out whatever difficulties we have in our own society. So I would say Othello and Merchant of Venice, these great studies of prejudice and division and hatred, which Shakespeare is so interested in, are the plays that really have resonance right now. All right, thank you.
Thank you.